Hello.
Hi.
My name is Sarika Devan from UNODC Enneki Center of Excellence, and I'm here today with John Caulkins. Thank you very much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
John is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College and is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and has nearly 30 years of experience in researching drug markets and illicit markets. Mm-hmm. Thanks again for joining us. We're going to be asking you a few questions about your research today. And my first question would be, according to your research, how do you estimate the size of illicit drug markets?
With difficulty. Obviously, these are criminals. They don't just report voluntarily. The literature is longest for drug markets, and there's basically three approaches. Mm-hmm. The demand-side approaches start with some notion of how many users there are and multiply by how much they consume per week or month, and also how much they spend per week or month if you're focused on dollars. Mm-hmm. That works best for something like cannabis that people will talk about relatively openly. Then there are supply-side approaches. They work best for things like cocaine that comes from coca bushes and heroin that comes from poppy flowers, because you start with satellite pictures and you get an estimate of how many hectares are under cultivation, you have guesses about yield per hectare, and then there are these conversion factors to follow it through the chemical processing. And then sometimes there are sort of surrogates or proxies. The best example of that, it's kind of exciting technology that's come along recently, is wastewater monitoring. You literally take a sample of the water coming out of or into a sewage treatment plant, how many drugs are in there, and if you do the right math with chemistry, that gives you an idea of how many drugs were used in the catchment area that feeds into that wastewater stream. So there's a bunch of ways.
Okay, and how would it work with human trafficking, for example?
Oh, even worse and even harder, honestly. Human trafficking is difficult for all of the same reasons. It's not like the people in the trade are regularly reporting their activity, but also there are these definitional problems, right? Because for people who meet the legal definition of being trafficked, doing a particular thing, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, there are other people who are merely exploited and badly treated by their employer, but they don't meet the definition of being trafficked. And those definitions also vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So now human trafficking is probably even harder. And the complication for wildlife trafficking is there are just so many different kinds of species out there. For drugs, at least you can say, well, there's cannabis, heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, new psychoactive substances. Well, that's complicated, but it's still only a half dozen or so. With wildlife, there are scores of different species, and every one you have to approach differently. So it's really quite complicated.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And how would you integrate the generation of statistical data with the work of the criminal justice systems, and mainly in the police and prosecution?
So the criminal justice system's pretty good a lot of times because they have to record their own activities for their own performance measures. But there's still limitations, because lots of times when you focus on the criminal justice statistics, you're finding as much about our response and how hard we're working against it as about the actual activity. So I'd say a couple of things. The first is to really encourage law enforcement people to recognize the value of strategic intelligence, to try to understand that whole picture, that whole market, to inform policy and strategy. Whereas the tendency in law enforcement is often to focus on tactical information, what's necessary to make a particular case. And then also to remember, it's not just criminal justice. Even when the activity is illegal, it still can be very important to triangulate with health and other forms of data. You want to understand how many people are using a drug, then the number of people going into treatment, and tragically, the number of people who end up dying of overdose. Those are other complementary sources of information. And if you bring them together, you can do better than if you're only using the criminal justice data.
And in your opinion, would you say that that's easier to do for drug trafficking or human trafficking or wildlife trafficking, or
well, we have a longer history of investing substantially in that data and analytic infrastructure for drugs. Mm-hmm. One of the benefits of having been working in this area so long is that I can remember when the data on drug markets were really limited. And so I can look at how limited they are in human trafficking and wildlife trafficking and say, okay, let's be patient. It may take decades of substantial investment on the part of individual nations, on the part of academics, on the part of organizations like UNODC. But over time, if we invest in both the primary data collection and also supporting analytical efforts to try to integrate those, we can understand better this phenomenon. And when we understand it better, we can fight it better.
Absolutely. Very well said. Thank you so much for taking the time.
It's my pleasure.
And all the best for the rest of the conference.
Thank you.